He built this hotel with his bare hands. Tonight, they won't even let him inside. One phone call from grief. One reservation. That's all he needed tonight. She didn't see a guest. She saw a hoodie. And she made her decision in 3 seconds. He told a grieving father to take his crying daughter to a shelter. He had no idea who he was talking to. He wasn't a stranger off the street. He was the man who signed every one of their paychecks.
The rain hit the windshield so hard that Jack Bennett could barely see the neon sign of his own, hotel, glowing through the storm. If you've ever been judged by the way you look instead of who you really are, stay with this video until the end, because what happens tonight at the front desk of the Ashford Grand will remind you why kindness should never depend on appearances. And if this story moves, you hit that like button and subscribe, because there is so much more of this journey ahead. Jack was 37 years old, a broad-shouldered man with tired blue eyes, a 2-day stubble, and hands that still had calluses from the years before success came easy. He wore a faded gray hoodie, jeans with a small tear at the knee, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, the brim soaked from the walk across the parking lot. Beside him, holding his hand and shivering in a purple raincoat 2 sizes too big, was his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, her dark curls plastered to her cheeks, her stuffed rabbit clutched so tightly to her chest that its ear was nearly torn off. They had been driving for 6 hours straight, coming from a small town 2 states away, where Jack had just buried his mother, the woman who had raised Lily every day while Jack worked to keep his company alive, after his wife left them both when Lily was barely 2. Grief sat heavy in his chest, heavier than the rain outside, and all he wanted now was a warm room, a hot shower for his little girl, and a bed where she could finally sleep. What Jack Bennett did not advertise, what almost no one outside his closest circle knew by looking at him, was that he owned the Ashford Grand, not as an investor hiding behind a corporation, but as the man who had built it, brick by brick, deal by deal, over 12 relentless years. He was the founder and CEO of Bennett Hospitality Group, a chain of 19 boutique hotels across the country, and the Ashford Grand downtown was the crown jewel, the flagship property he had poured his soul into. But tonight, exhausted and grieving, dressed like any tired traveler who had been on the road too long, Jack was nobody. Tonight, he was just a father trying to get his daughter out of the rain. The automatic doors hissed open, and warm golden light spilled across the wet marble floor of the lobby. A grand chandelier glittered above them, its crystal arms catching the light like a frozen firework. Jack squeezed Lily's hand and gave her a tired smile. "Almost there, baby," he whispered. "Warm bed, I promise." Behind the reception desk stood Denise Colton, mid-30s, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her makeup flawless, her uniform pressed to perfection. She had worked the front desk for 6 years and prided herself on what she called reading people. She looked up as Jack and Lily approached, dripping onto the floor, and her expression shifted instantly, not into welcome, but into something colder, something practiced. Her eyes swept over Jack's hoodie, his torn jeans, the mud on his boots, and then down at Lily's oversized raincoat. "Can I help you?" Denise asked, her tone clipped, already suspicious. "Yes, hi," Jack said, wiping rain from his face. "Reservation under Bennett. Jack Bennett," Denise typed slowly, her manicured nails clicking against the keyboard, though her eyes kept drifting back to Jack's appearance rather than the screen. "I'm not finding anything under that name," she said flatly. "That's strange," Jack said, pulling out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. "I booked it myself 2 days ago. Confirmation number should be right here." He turned the phone screen toward her, but Denise barely glanced at it. "Sir, if the system doesn't show it, it doesn't show it," she said, folding her arms. "We're fully booked tonight anyway. There's a convention in town. Could you just double-check? Maybe search by date instead of name," Jack asked, keeping his voice calm for Lily's sake. though exhaustion was cracking at the edges of his patience. Denise sighed audibly, the kind of sigh meant to be heard.
Sir, I really don't have time to run multiple searches for every guest who walks in without a confirmation email pulled up. Do you have a printed confirmation? I have the email right here, Jack said, still holding out the phone. It says confirmed. 1 king suite, 2 nights. Denise's eyes flicked toward Lily, then back to Jack, and something in her face hardened further, as if she had already decided the story before it finished being told. I'm going to be honest with you, she said, lowering her voice as though doing him a favor. This is a 5-star property. Rooms here start at $450 a night. If you're looking for something more affordable, there's a motel about 10 minutes down the highway that might be a better fit for your situation. Lily looked up at her father, confused by the woman's tone, and Jack felt something tighten in his throat, not for himself, but for his daughter, standing in a puddle of rainwater, watching a stranger decide she didn't belong somewhere warm. I can afford the room, Jack said quietly. I made the reservation. I have the confirmation. I just need you to look again. That was when Craig Mercer, the on-duty manager, stepped out from the back office, drawn by the tension in Denise's posture. Craig was tall, thin, with slicked back hair, and a tie knotted just a little too tight, the kind of man who measured his own importance by how many people he could make feel small. Denise turned to him with visible relief. Craig, this guest is insisting he has a reservation, but I'm not finding it. And honestly, I think there might be some confusion. Craig looked Jack up and down the same way Denise had, and his mouth curled into a thin, condescending smile. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside so we can help our other guests. If you don't have a valid reservation and the appropriate form of payment, I'm afraid we can't accommodate you tonight. I have a credit card. I have a confirmation email, and I have a reservation under my own name at my own. Jack stopped himself, biting back the words, not wanting to make a scene in front of Lily, not wanting to pull rank on exhausted employees who were simply doing their jobs badly. Please, just check the system for Bennett, Bennett. Tonight's date. Craig didn't check anything. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping into something meant to sound reasonable, but landed as pure condescension. Look, I understand times are hard for a lot of people, but we can't just let anyone walk in off the street claiming they have a room. We have a reputation to protect. There are shelters not far from here, and I'd be happy to have someone call ahead for you and your daughter. The words hit like a slap. Jack felt heat rush up his neck, not from embarrassment, but from a deep, quiet fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. He looked down at Lily, who had gone very still, her small hand tightening in his. Daddy, she whispered, why doesn't he want us here? Before Jack could answer, a young valet named Sophia Reyes, barely 22, her uniform vest a size too big, hurried over from the door, where she had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort. Excuse me, she said carefully, glancing nervously between Craig and Jack. I can help pull up the reservation on the other terminal if that's easier. Sophia, this isn't your department, Craig snapped without even looking at her. Get back to the valet stand. Sophia hesitated, torn between her job and the sick feeling twisting in her stomach as she watched a man and his soaked, frightened little girl being spoken to like criminals. She stepped back, but she didn't leave. She stood near the pillar, watching, her jaw tight. Near the entrance, an older doorman named Ray Whitmore had also noticed the commotion. Ray had worked at the Ashford Grand since the week it opened, 12 years earlier, and something about the tired set of Jack's shoulders, the shape of his jaw beneath the stubble, struck him as painfully familiar. Ray had met Jack Bennett exactly twice before, once at the grand opening ribbon cutting and once at a staff Christmas party 3 years ago when Jack had personally shaken every employee's hand. Ray's stomach dropped as recognition crept over him, but he hesitated, uncertain, telling himself he had to be wrong, because surely the owner of the hotel wouldn't be standing here in a wet hoodie being told to go find a shelter. Sir,
I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the desk, Craig said, his voice rising now, drawing the attention of guests crossing the lobby. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I'll have no choice but to call security. I am not causing a disturbance, Jack said, his voice low and steady, though his hands had curled into fists at his sides. I am asking you to do your job and look up a reservation. That's all I have asked for the last 5 minutes. Security, Craig said flatly into his radio, not breaking eye contact with Jack, a small, satisfied smirk tugging at his lips, as if he had just won something. Front desk, please. Lily began to cry, quiet, frightened tears, and that sound broke something loose in Jack's chest. Not anger anymore. Grief, exhaustion, and the crushing unfairness of a day that had already taken his mother from him and was now taking his daughter's sense of safety too. He crouched down, ignoring Craig entirely, and wrapped his arms around Lily. Hey, look at me, baby. I've got you. Nobody is going to hurt us. I promise. 2 security guards, Tony and Marcus, arrived moments later, their expressions uncertain as they took in the scene. A crying child, a soaked and clearly weary father, and a manager pointing at them like they were trespassers. Tony, the older of the two, looked at Jack for a long moment, and something about his face made Tony pause before reaching for anything. Sir, Tony said carefully, can I see some ID, please? Let's just figure this out calmly. Jack straightened, lifted Lily gently into his arms, and reached into the inside pocket of his hoodie with his free hand. He pulled out his wallet, and instead of handing over his driver's license first, he handed over a laminated card that few people outside corporate leadership ever saw. His Bennett Hospitality Group Executive Access Card, complete with his photograph, his title, and his signature embossed in gold along the bottom. Jack Bennett, founder and chief executive officer. The lobby seemed to go silent. Tony's eyes widened. Marcus leaned in to look, then took a full step back. Denise, who had been watching with arms still crossed, felt the blood drain from her face as she read the title beneath the photograph 3 times, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. Craig snatched the card from Tony's hand, squinting at it under the chandelier light, his smug expression cracking apart piece by piece until his face had gone the color of old paper. This has to be some kind of mistake, Craig stammered. I mean, you can't be. I own this hotel, Jack said quietly, still holding his daughter, who had stopped crying and was now watching the grown-ups with wide, curious eyes. I own 18 others just like it. I have owned this company since before either of you were hired, and I came here tonight on the worst day of my year, needing nothing more than a room for my daughter and me, and I was told to go find a shelter. Ray Whitmore, who had been standing frozen near the entrance, finally stepped forward, removing his cap. Mr. Bennett, he said softly, I recognized you when you walked in. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry, sir. I truly am. Jack looked at him and nodded once, not with anger, but with something gentler. You didn't do anything wrong, Ray. Thank you for being honest just now. He turned back to Craig and Denise, both of whom looked as though the marble floor might swallow them whole. What I want to know, Jack said, his voice carrying evenly across the lobby, is how many other families have stood exactly where I'm with, standing tonight, and been turned away because they didn't look wealthy enough for you. Neither of them answered. Sophia, still standing near the pillar, felt her heart pounding, unsure whether she too would be swept into whatever consequence was coming. Within 20 minutes, Margaret Chen, the hotel's regional director of human resources, arrived from her apartment 3 blocks away, having received an urgent call from hotel security. Margaret was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had worked alongside Jack since the company's earliest days, back when they were converting a single rundown motel into the first Bennett property. She listened to the security footage review, watched the replay from 3 different camera angles in the back office, and watched Jack's calm, unwavering account of what had happened corroborated by both Tony and Sophia, who bravely gave her honest statement despite her nerves. Margaret did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Craig and Denise across the small office table and said, "Discrimination based on someone's appearance, refusing to properly verify a reservation, and directing a paying guest and his child to a homeless shelter is not a mistake. It is a pattern of behavior, and tonight it has consequences. Effective immediately, both of your employment with Bennett Hospitality Group is terminated." Denise began to protest, her voice cracking. "Please, I have bills. I didn't know he was—" "That is exactly the point," Jack said gently but firmly from the doorway, Lily now asleep against his shoulder, wrapped in a warm blanket someone had finally brought her. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic human decency. My daughter watched 2 adults decide she didn't belong somewhere warm because of what her father was wearing. That is the part I cannot forgive tonight." Craig said nothing at all. He simply gathered his things in silence and walked out through the staff entrance, avoiding every set of eyes in the room. Later that night, after Lily had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep in a suite at the hotel, staff scrambled to prepare. Jack sat alone by the window, watching the rain finally begin to ease over the city skyline. He thought about the man he used to be, 25 years old, sleeping in the back office of a single rundown motel because he couldn't both rent and payroll for his 3 employees. He thought about Tom Hargrove, his oldest friend and original business partner, who had lent him $11,000 from his own savings account to keep that first motel's doors open during a brutal winter when bookings dried up completely. Jack picked up his phone and called him, even though it was well past midnight. "You're not going to believe the night I've had," Jack said when Tom picked up, his voice groggy, but immediately alert once he heard the strain in Jack's tone. Tom listened in silence as Jack recounted everything. The drive, the funeral that morning, Lily's tears, Denise's cold dismissal, Craig's cruelty, the shelter comment that still echoed in Jack's ears like a wound that refused to close. When Jack finished, Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Jack," he finally said, "this isn't the first complaint like this. I didn't want to bring it up before your mother's funeral, but corporate has had at least 6 guest complaints over the past 4 months about staff at 2 of our properties being dismissive toward guests who didn't, in the guests' words, look like they belonged. I flagged it to regional management. I don't think it ever reached you." The words hit Jack harder than Craig's smirk ever could. 6 complaints, 2 properties. Somewhere along the way, in the relentless push to open new hotels, chase 5-star ratings, and satisfy investors who cared only about occupancy numbers, something quieter and far more important had slipped through the cracks of his own company without his knowledge. "Send me everything you have," Jack said quietly. "Every complaint, every name, every property." Tonight, by 3 in the morning, sitting in the glow of his laptop, while Lily slept peacefully beside him, Jack had read through every flagged complaint personally. An elderly veteran turned away from a hotel bar because his jacket looked too worn. A single mother in scrubs, fresh off a hospital shift, questioned twice about her ability to pay before even reaching the counter. A teenager traveling alone to visit a sick grandparent, treated with open suspicion by front desk staff who assumed the worst before asking a single kind question. Pattern after pattern, each one a quiet failure Jack had never known was happening beneath the surface of a company he had built specifically to make people feel welcome. The rainy lobby confrontation with his own daughter, painful as it was, had cracked open a door Jack now understood he could not close again. There was a mystery buried inside his own company, and he intended to follow it all the way down, property by property, name by name, until he understood exactly how deep it went and exactly who else needed to be held accountable. The following weeks changed the Ashford Grand in ways no one, least of all Jack, had fully anticipated. He launched what he called the Dignity First initiative across all 19 properties, requiring every employee, from housekeeping to general managers, to complete new training centered on treating every guest, regardless of appearance, accent, income, or background, with equal respect and thoroughness. He personally visited each hotel over the following 2 months, sometimes announced, sometimes not, determined to ensure that no other family would ever be humiliated the way his had been that rainy night. Sophia Reyes, whose quiet courage in trying to help and later in telling the truth had not gone unnoticed, was promoted to guest relations supervisor within a month, with Jack personally recommending her for a leadership development program the company funded for promising young employees. Ray Whitmore, moved by the entire experience, was asked by Jack to help design part of the new training program himself, drawing on his 12 years of quietly noticing which staff treated every guest, famous or forgotten, with the same warmth. Tony, the security guard who had chosen calm verification over aggressive assumption, was recognized publicly at the company's annual meeting as a model of how security should always be handled, with respect first, force only as an absolute last resort. Jack also did something few executives ever do. He wrote a letter, posted publicly on the company's website, and read by millions after a local news story picked it up, describing exactly what had happened that night, without hiding his own identity or softening his family's pain. He wrote about his mother's funeral that same day, about Lily's tears in the lobby, about the sinking realization that his own company, the one he had built from nothing to protect and provide for people, had allowed cruelty to take root in the very lobby meant to welcome the world. He wrote, in his own words, that success had never been about marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but about whether a tired father and his frightened daughter, soaked from the rain and grieving a loss no child should have to carry, could walk through any door of any hotel bearing his name and be treated like they mattered. He wrote that dignity should never be a luxury reserved for those who look like they can afford it, and that from that night forward, it would never again be optional at any property he owned. Months later, on a quiet evening with far less rain and far more warmth, Jack returned to the same lobby of the Ashford Grand, this time with Lily skipping ahead of him, in a yellow raincoat she insisted on wearing, even though the sky was perfectly clear. Sophia, now behind the desk in her new supervisor uniform, looked up and broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Bennett," she said, then knelt slightly toward Lily. "And welcome back to you too, Miss Lily. We saved your favorite room." Lily grinned and looked up at her father. "They remembered me, Daddy." "They did," Jack said, feeling something settle quietly in his chest, something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like peace, because that's what this place is supposed to do. Remember people, all people. As they walked toward the elevator, Ray tipped his cap and smiled warmly, and across the lobby, a young couple in worn travel clothes approached the desk uncertainly, clearly bracing for judgment out of habit, built by other places, other nights. Sophia greeted them with the same bright, unwavering warmth she gave every single guest, famous or forgotten, wealthy or weary, and welcomed them home. Jack thought about the 6 complaints Tom had shown him weeks earlier, about the elderly veteran and the tired nurse and the frightened teenager, and he made a quiet promise to himself that the investigation would never truly end, that every property would be checked and rechecked, not out of suspicion of his employees, but out of respect for every stranger who ever walked through a Bennett Hospitality Group door, hoping simply to be seen as human. Jack watched for a moment before stepping into the elevator, and he understood then that the truest measure of what he had built was not in the chandeliers or the marble or the 19 properties bearing his name. It was in a single small moment, repeating itself over and over, in every lobby, on every rainy night, whenever someone walked through the door uncertain of their welcome and found it anyway. Because in the end, the story was never really about a denied room or a lost job. It was about the simple, unbreakable truth that everyone, regardless of what they are wearing or what they seem to have, deserves to be treated like they belong. And if this story reminded you of that, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it too.